Hello, everyone. Welcome to KTAL News Now. I'm your host, Anthony Mocklin, and today is Friday, which means it is Football Friday here at KTAL News Now. And here we'll be recapping the Thursday night game that happened last night in the NFL, and then looking ahead to some huge college games across all the power conferences as the playoffs start to ramp up. People are fighting for the one of those 12 spots and spots in their conference championship games. Now, I want to start off with last night's game with the Buffalo Bills taking on the Houston Texans. Now, this game, I don't think a lot of people expected Houston to win. They ended up winning this one 23-19 despite late efforts from Buffalo in this one. And the Texans, they've snuck up on a lot of people because they started off 0-3 this season, and now they sit at 6-5 on the year, and they are getting back their starting quarterback, CJ Stroud, as he returns from a concussion. And during his absence, it was a 3-game stretch where Davis Mills had to step up and be the quarterback, and they went 3-0 in those games with Mills under center. So they're in a really, really great spot for him to return and to try to make that last minute playoff push as the AFC gets tighter and tighter with a lot of top heavy teams like the Patriots, Broncos, and the Colts. And then everybody else is essentially trying to fight for what's left after that in the whether it's the wild card or winning the division, which will be pretty tough considering, like I said, those teams that are leading the AFC conference, they are first in all of their divisions, so it's going to be pretty tough to win one of those. But the Bills, on the other hand, they have struggled as of late. They have dropped 2 of their last 3 games. They now sit at 7-4 on the season. Any chances of them winning the AFC East are dwindling as the Patriots sit at 9-2, and they get to take on the Cincinnati Bengals next week without Jamar Chase because he is serving a suspension. If you saw the clip of him spitting on Steelers cornerback Jalen Ramsey, and Ramsey ended up retaliating and throwing a punch, but because Jamar Chase was on video spitting on him, even though he denied that he did so, the NFL stepped in and said, hey, you're done for this week. You got to sit out. He even tried to appeal it, but it just, they weren't having it. Let's just say that. But in this game last night, the Texans defense was able to get to quarterback Josh Allen of the Bills pretty much all night. He ended up being sacked 8 times. And as mobile as Josh Allen is and evasive and elusive in the pocket, this should not happen in any scenario for the Buffalo Bills because he is just too talented for them. He won the MVP last year. You cannot afford to let him get hit so much behind the offensive line. They have to do a better job up front. And they also had a fumble recovery and forced Josh Allen into throwing 2 interceptions. So, like I said, they got pressure all night and forced him to make those mistakes, especially late. And I will say, if you saw the end of the game, it was a little bit crazy because a bunch of penalties and back-to-back sacks got the Bills to 4th and 27. It was down to their last ditched effort, and they ended up throwing a pass underneath and then ran a hook and ladder where one receiver catches it underneath and then he lateraled it to another one who ended up turning upfield, and they turned a 4th and 27 into a 44-yard gain to end up picking the first down. So at that point, they had a ton of momentum. As soon as I saw that play, I don't know if y'all had the same reaction, but I was like, oh my gosh, they're going to march down and win the game now. But the Texans defense stood tall against the Bills, and it was a 4th and 1 inside Texans territory at that point, and a false start penalty made it 4th and 6, which, let's be honest, if you were watching, the Bills' offensive line was jumping early pretty much every play, especially late. And a 4th and 6 ended up forcing the Bills to pass, and then the Texans came up with a game-sealing interception at the end to hang on to win. And one stat that piqued my interest and I found really interesting was that the Bills, whenever running back James Cook rushes for over 100 yards, were 12-1 in his career going into this game. And he ended up having 116 rushing yards and a touchdown, but they ended up losing this game. So in James Cook's career when he rushes for over 100 yards. The Bills are now 12-2, which I found pretty fascinating considering the ground game clearly was working for them, albeit James Cook did have a huge 45-yard run to tack onto his total. But still, the numbers usually do not lie, and I'm very surprised that the Bills weren't able to capitalize on their ground game in this one. But the defense really let them down, considering the fact that the Texans scored 20 points in the first half. So they were already in a deep hole. And then they locked in a little bit in the second half where the Texans only scored 3 points, but then the offense couldn't capitalize on the defense's efforts in that one. And looking ahead for the Texans, like I said, they get CJ Stroud back, their quarterback who returns from a concussion, and they go on to face the first in the AFC Colts, which not really feeling too great about that one, and then the Chiefs back-to-back. So pretty rough stretch for a team that is trying to turn its season around. Like I said, they started 0-3, and they didn't have a lot of hope at the end, a lot of light at the end of the tunnel for them, but they are right in the mix of the AFC playoff hunt. But Buffalo, on the other hand, they get Pittsburgh, the Bengals, without Joe Burrow still, so that should be a win for them. I think they can win against Pittsburgh as well. And then they face my New England Patriots again. If you recall earlier in the season, the Patriots ended up beating them on prime time in Buffalo. Insane game. I don't know if y'all saw it. It was a great game. I was really happy about it. Like I said, that's my favorite team for those of you who don't know. But we'll see if the Patriots can complete the season sweep. I think they do hang on to win the division, even if they do lose this game against Buffalo. It's very hard to beat a divisional opponent twice, let alone if they meet again in the playoffs 3 times in the same season. That's rarely ever been done, but we'll see what happens. I think that New England, there's a lot of talk about how easy their schedule is, which is true in terms of strength of schedule. They are 32nd, dead last in the NFL, but they clearly have beaten the Bills. They've beaten the Buccaneers, who are also very good. And, once the playoffs come, we'll see what they're really made of, because that's when the lights get brighter, plays matter more, every yard counts. So we'll see what happens with that going forward and how the playoff picture ends up shaping up. But looking ahead to college football, speaking of playoffs, the college football playoff, there's a lot of implications in this one. And looking over to the SEC, we have number 22 Missouri heading to number 8 Oklahoma. Now, if you recall, Oklahoma just beat then number 4 Alabama in a huge win on the road for them. So that was very, very impressive. I did not think they were going to win that game. Alabama was absolutely rolling up until that point, and especially at home, their track record at home was so good. If you tuned in to last week's episode of Football Friday, you'll know I made my prediction for that game, and I obviously chose Alabama. Clearly, I was wrong. I own up to that, but I did not expect Oklahoma to come into there and win. But clearly, they are for real, and they belong in the playoff if they can get it done against Missouri here. And this is a very interesting matchup because you have what's I want to call an unstoppable force meets an immovable object in the fact that the country's leading rusher, Ahmad Hardy for Missouri, is going against the number 4 rushing defense in Oklahoma. So it's really going to be cool to see who bends or breaks in this matchup. That is 100% what I'm looking forward to in this game. That is one thing to watch out for if you are looking for a between the yards kind of matchup. Just look to see how they plan to attack Oklahoma's running game, especially considering that Missouri has been so great on the ground all year. Like I said, Ahmad Hardy is first in the nation in rushing yards. And one really, really cool fact about Hardy, who has rushed for over 1,300 yards and 15 touchdowns, of those over 1,300 yards, almost 1,000 of them have come after contact. And that is I don't know about y'all, that is something I have never even seen or heard of before. That is just crazy to me that in 10 games you have almost 1,000 yards after a defender contacts you or tries to tackle you. Like, he is just so slippery when it comes to running, and credit to him because the fact that he has that many yards after contact, usually that means your offensive line isn't the best. So the fact that he's able to still churn out, lead the nation in rushing yards despite that fact, yes, it's incredible talent that they have. But we'll see what they can do to stop him when it comes to Oklahoma's defense. And against Mississippi State, he ended up rushing for 300 yards and 3 touchdowns. So he was just absolutely feasting. We were talking Ashton Genty numbers from last year at Boise State. I mean, that's just absolutely ridiculous, especially against a conference opponent. Like, that's just unheard of today. 300 rushing yards, like, come on. But Missouri is a 7.5-point underdog on the road here. And I'm not going to lie, I know Alabama, they just lost to Oklahoma, but I kind of like Missouri on the road here, especially with it being over a touchdown. I like taking the points here. Again, this is not financial advice or anything when it comes to betting, but I mean, I just think that the spread is just a little bit too much here. I think that Oklahoma still ends up winning the game 100%. But I think that Missouri is able to keep it close, especially considering the fact that they have a very underrated defense. If you look at the numbers, they are top 15 in yards per play allowed. And when it comes to third down conversions, they're also in the top 15 when it comes to that allowing third teams to convert on third downs. And this one, don't expect a shootout. It'll probably be a very low scoring game because Oklahoma's defense, we already know how good they are, but I think offensively, they are a little bit stagnant when it comes to moving the ball. If you look at the raw numbers when it comes to comparing them against other teams in the country, Oklahoma's offense, they rank 64th in scoring, 98th in total offense, and 98th in yards per play, which is not what you want to see out of a top 10 team. And if you're banking on them if they have national championship aspirations here, they really got to get their offense working, especially down the stretch, because it's now or never at this point. But don't expect a shootout in this one. I like Missouri to keep it close in what I expect to be a low-scoring game. But looking over to the Big Ten, this one is probably the most important in the playoff race this year, and it involves number 15 USC taking on number 7 Oregon. Now, this is essentially an elimination game for both teams when it comes to a playoff spot, because USC, they are still fighting for a Big Ten conference championship appearance. They are 8-2, so they have a tougher hill to climb. But if they end up beating Oregon, I think they can secure a spot here. It's just going to be really tough with Ohio State and Indiana, who are the number 1 and number 2 teams in the country right now. That's going to be very, very tough to try to kick one of them out of being in that spot. I don't see either of them faltering in the last few games of the season, but crazier things have happened. USC on the road this year has been pretty rough, especially going back to last year when they first joined the Big Ten. If you look at their track record on the road against ranked opponents, they are 0-5 on the road against ranked teams since joining the conference, which is not what you want to see. And if you're someone who's interested in the head-to-head history of the matchups between USC and Oregon, USC has lost 3 straight games against Oregon, and their last win versus them was back in 2011, albeit they didn't play a whole lot because of the conference alignments and everything like that, but it's just very, very worrisome if you are a USC fan. But a loss for Oregon here means they are completely out of the playoffs, and it would cost them an appearance in the Big Ten championship game, obviously. But they ended up, their only loss this year was to number 2 Indiana, but they barely beat unranked Iowa. If you saw that game, they only won by 2, which was a head scratcher for most people. But USC coincidentally also struggled against Iowa. They found themselves down 21-7 in that game, and they had to come all the way back to win 26-21. So very concerning for both sides of these teams. And for USC, wide receiver Mekhi Lemon, he is second in the nation in yards per game with 109 receiving yards per game. Oregon is definitely going to have to find a way to stop that. They are third in total yards allowed per game. So it's going to be very, very interesting to see how they game plan for Lemon. USC is a 10.5 point underdog here on the road, which again, I think it's too many points when you have two top 15 teams going head to head here. I get it that Oregon's at home, but I think USC is able to keep it close. Maybe Oregon still wins the game, but I think USC is able to keep it close because, like I said, with their wide receivers, they arguably have one of the best wide receiver duos in the nation with Lemon and Jacoby Lane. And Indiana against Oregon, their only loss, they were able to put up over 320 total yards of offense and 30 points. So that was a little suspect. And USC is really clicking on offense as of late. And I think they can absolutely keep up with Oregon. I don't think it'll be a shootout per se, but I think they'll be able to stay within a score or two that in the points that they're getting on the road here. But looking ahead to the ACC, this one is another really, really important one for playoffs because you have unranked Pittsburgh against number 16 Georgia Tech. Now, Pittsburgh is in a very, very tough spot because while if you looked at last week's episode of Football Friday, you'll know that Pittsburgh's coach said that they didn't care if they lost by 100 to Notre Dame, which it certainly felt like they did because they got demolished in that game, but that the last two games of the season were the only ones that matter, and they absolutely need to win this game and then against Miami to punch their way through the ACC championship game. But this is going to be a very, very, very tough test for them because Georgia Tech offensively is absolutely elite in terms of yards per game. They are first in the country, averaging almost 500 yards of offense per game, which is insane. But their defense, on the other hand, not a whole lot to show for it because they are 97th or lower, almost outside the top 100 when it comes to yards per game, passing yards per game, and rushing yards per game. So they are pretty much a bunch of traffic cones out there on defense. Can't really stop a whole lot. And they barely survived on the road against Boston College. They needed a 19-point fourth quarter just to win by 2 in that game on the road for Boston College. So that was very, very alarming for me, looking at them with a team that has been really, really good all year. And I know people like to discredit the Clemson win now earlier in the season, but Clemson at that time was a very highly ranked team, and they ended up getting it done at home, and they have been hit the ground running ever since then. But when it comes to Pittsburgh with the Panthers, they're a very, very pass-heavy team when it comes to their rate of passing and the amount of yards they rack up passing. They are 14th in passing yards per game in the country. But running the ball, they don't do a whole lot of that because they are 110th in rushing yards per game. But their defense, on the other hand, is pretty solid. They are 32nd in yards per game allowed, 9th in rushing yards per game allowed, but 91st in passing yards per game allowed. So their secondary has a lot of holes in it that Georgia Tech could end up exploiting. Like I said, they are first in the nation in yards per game. But this is, like I said, this is a must-win for Pittsburgh here, who unfortunately end up getting demolished by Notre Dame last week, although they really didn't matter to them in the grand scheme of things, I guess. But still, I mean, you got to put up some kind of fight against a top 10 team. You got to want to earn your spot instead of just coasting and looking ahead to next week against Georgia Tech and Miami. You can't do that. You have to focus on one game at a time, and hopefully that's what they do here. I think that still Georgia Tech ends up winning this game, and that's mostly due to their offense, like I was saying, and which is led by quarterback Haynes King. He is one of the best quarterbacks in the nation this year. He is completing almost 73% of his passes, on his way to over 2,200 passing yards and 24 total touchdowns and just 2 interceptions. And he actually leads the team in rushing with over 800 rushing yards and 14 touchdowns. So if you add all that up, that's over 3,000 yards of total offense and 24 total touchdowns with just 2 picks. He has been money all year, and I expect them to continue that tomorrow against Pitt, who averages 2 turnovers per game, which is not what you want out of your offense. Plus, they're on the road. Give me Georgia Tech in this one. I'm taking the Yellow Jackets. But looking over to the biggest game in the Big 12, we have a very, very key matchup with number 11 BYU heading to Cincinnati. Now, Cincinnati is unranked in this game, but the spread and BYU is only a very, very slight favorite in this one. And there is a huge reason why. And it is because that Cincinnati, when it comes to rushing yards per game and passing yards per game, they are both in the top 25 when it comes to that. But their defense, on the other hand, is outside the top 85 in pretty much every metric. So this is something that BYU may be able to exploit, considering they are also top 25 in points per game and rushing yards per game. So they'll look to the ground on this one most likely. And their defense has been pretty solid. They are 13th in points per game allowed and 26th in total yards per game allowed. Their only loss is to Texas Tech, but I think they're still the better team in this one. This is a must-win for BYU, obviously, if they want to stay in the playoff race. And if they lose, they would pretty much knock them out of a playoff spot, unfortunately. I don't think Cincinnati would vault into their spot at all, but this could be a season ruiner just because from Cincinnati, because they really don't have a whole lot to gain from this. Meanwhile, BYU has almost everything to lose in this one. So there's a lot of pressure on the Cougars in this one. Cincinnati, they have looked pretty bad as of late. They have 2 straight losses, both to conference opponents, which are Utah and Arizona. And in that Arizona game, they were pretty much dominated in the second half. They really didn't have a chance to keep up with them. They started out really hot, but then couldn't keep up when it mattered. But then in the Utah game, they were absolutely demolished in this game. They lost 45-14 against Utah, which if you look at it on paper and their play styles, their schemes, Utah is a very, very similar team to BYU, which is why I will be taking BYU to at least win the game, maybe cover the spread. The spread right now, they're favored by 2.5 points. Points, I think they could win by 3 or more, but I think they're still going to win outright regardless in a very, very tough game. I think it'll still be close. I think it could be a shootout potentially, but BYU's defense kind of might reel that in a little bit. But that's all I have today for today's episode of Football Friday. Let me know your takes. If you have any hot takes or predictions for this weekend, be sure to email me at amocklin@ktalnews.com. But you can find all of our previous editions of KTAL News Now and last week's episode of Football Friday on our YouTube page at KTAL News. But we stream every day, Monday through Friday at 1 p.m. on ktalnews.com, which is also where you can get all of your local breaking and trending stories. But for now, I'm Anthony Mocklin. Have a great rest of your day and weekend, and thank you for joining us.